بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. من يهدي الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear sisters, my dear daughters and sons, welcome back to a new episode of the Mothers of Believers. Last lesson we spoke about our mother Salama and how she was having a lot of suffering, a lot of difficulty during her migration from Mecca to Al-Madinah. And when she arrived at Al-Madinah, she reunited back to her family. Shortly after that, she lost her husband in Uhud battle. And after that, the Prophet ﷺ proposed to her, and she became one of the mothers of believers. And after that, we mentioned that there was a lot of shiny points started to appear in the personality of Sayyida Salama. She was knowledgeable and she was smart. The Prophet ﷺ used to take her opinion, and we mentioned that especially during the Hudaybiyah event. Actually, today, inshallah, we're going to continue with Sayyida Salama, the wife who saw Jibril. Sayyida Salama, she saw Jibril, but when he was in the shape of one of the companions. Usually Jibril came to the Prophet in many times in many shapes. The only two times that Prophet ﷺ he saw Jibril in his real shape was during the Isra and the Mi'raj, and the first one during the Ghar Hira, or the cave of Hira, when he starts to tell him that he will be the prophet of this ummah. So one day, Jibril alayhi salam came in the form of one of the companion, was named his Dihya. Dihya al-Kalbi was one of the companion. He was a very good looking person, and Jibril alayhi salam used to come in his shape or in his face. So she reported that one day Jibril alayhi salam came to the Prophet Muhammad. At that point, Sayyida Salama was with the Prophet. After talking to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, Jibril got up and left. Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam turned to Sayyida Salama and asked her who was that. She answered that was Dihya. Dihya is the companion she knows. But actually, she didn't know that it was Jibril until she mentioned by herself. I swear that until I listened to the speech of the Prophet delivered in the mosque about the revelation that he had received from Jibril, at that time, I thought Jibril was Dihya. So he started to mention the revelation came to him and mentioned by Jibril. And at that time, she remembered that she saw Dihya, and she thought that Dihya is at the time she realized that Dihya was not Dihya. Dihya at that time was Jibril. He came in his shape. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about the Prophet ﷺ as a husband to her, to a Sayyida Salama. The Prophet ﷺ greatly valued Sayyida Salama, and according to a report by Sayyida Aisha, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would visit his wives after the afternoon prayer, and he would start these visits first with Sayyida Salama, as she was the eldest, and he would visit Sayyida Aisha lastly. According to what her daughter, we mentioned that Sayyida Salama had a children from Abu Salama, and it was Salama, and from those children was Zainab, a daughter called Zainab. And one day, Sayyidah Salama, she told the Prophet, "O Prophet of Allah, you have divided the Allah mercy and the blessings between the Ahlul Bayt, but you have forgotten me and my daughter." The Prophet ﷺ answered, "Both you and your daughter are from Ahlul Bayt." Ahlul Bayt is meaning the wives and the sons and daughters of the Prophet ﷺ, the grandsons also. All of them are called Ahlul Bayt. And this is what we are doing the blessings on them during our prayers when we say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Ali Muhammad. Ali Muhammad is the meaning the wives and the children and the grandchildren of the Prophet ﷺ. So since she has no children from the Prophet, she has already her children from her first husband. She was afraid that her children also is not under the title of Ahlul Bayt. But the Prophet ﷺ kindly calmed her and told her, "No, your daughter is from Ahl Bayt." Also, the Prophet loved the children of Sayyidah Salama as if they were his own and protected them. In fact, he married his stepson Salama. Remember, we mentioned that Salama, her son called Salama. He married Salama to Umama. Umama was the daughter of Hamza, his uncle, radiallahu anhu, who martyred in the Battle of Uhud. The calm and peaceful atmosphere of the Prophet's house continued until the Prophet became ill. And we remember when the Prophet ﷺ, at that time, he took the permission of all his wives to be treated in the house of, or in the chamber of Sayyidah Aisha. Sayyidah Salama and the other wives agreed that he should rest in the house of Sayyidah Aisha. After the death of the Prophet, Sayyidah Salama retreated to her home and began to lead a secluded life. She refrained from involving herself in daily events in society and devoted herself for worship. And Sayyidah Salama radiallahu anha was the last of the Prophet's wives to die. She died in the 61st year after Hijrah. And at that time, they mentioned that her age was around 84 years old. And as you mentioned, she is the last one of the Prophet's wives to die. She was buried in Baqi' cemetery in Medina, and Abu Huraira led the funeral prayer. Now, before leaving, our mother Salama would like to pass quickly on her virtues. What were the virtues of Sayyidah Salama? Sayyidah Salama, as we mentioned, she was very knowledgeable. She knows how to read and how to write. She was also a poet. Sayyidah Salama was a companion who was acquainted with fiqh and narrated hadith. Remember, who mentioned before from the wives of the Prophet that she was a faqiha and she narrated hadith. Who knows? The one who knows the name of a previous mother, we took her seerah and her life before, and she used to be a faqiha and she narrated many hadith about the Prophet. Who knows? The one who knows can please send me on the chat room. I want the name. One of the Prophet's wives, she used to have the title of faqiha and she narrated hadith. Yes, excellent, Bahija, Fatima and Janaiba, excellent. As-Sayyida Aisha. As-Sayyida Aisha bint Abi Bakr, yes, she is the one who was called faqiha and she was a scholar. Many of the companions were her students. So as we can see, Sayyidah Salama also used to have her opinion in the fiqh, and also she narrated around 378 hadith narrated by her. Remember, who can remember how many hadith narrated by Sayyidah Aisha? Approximately. Who can tell me? Bahija, yes, it is a little bit less than, but excellent answer. It's around 2,300, not 400, but excellent answer. MashaAllah, Bahija, Jazakumullahu khairan. Now, Sayyida Salama life was full of many examples of difficulties and sacrifices, and she underwent for Islam, and this was clear when we mentioned about her journey and her stay in Mecca, how much the 1 year was, she suffered a lot during this 1 year, and she was one of the first women believers and suffered persecution and torment at the hands of the disbelievers in Mecca. From the virtues of Sayyida Salama, patience. She was patient, reliance, complete reliance and submission to Allah, and Allah saved her from the hands of disbelievers, saved her during her journey to Mecca, to Medina from Mecca, and saved her and appreciated, also give all the full appreciation for her by making her one of the mothers of believers. In the situation that we studied about Sayyida Salama, when she decided to immigrate from Mecca to Medina alone, only with her baby, we can feel that she personally demonstrated great bravery, decision-making, and strong personality and belief. And this what should the Muslim woman to be like. The Muslim woman to have their decision, and if there's something related to their belief, they should follow their belief, and they follow the Quran and the Sunnah, what comes in it, and to be very brave in doing so, and not hesitated, and not waiting for the people, how the people will act, and they will act like them. No, the Muslim woman, very decisive and strong personality if it's related to her religion. Sayyida Salama is an exceptional example of a wife, mother, and believer, one who endured the difficulties thrown up by this world of trials, bearing them without giving up. And this is also from the meaning that we can learn from the virtues of Sayyida Salama, that she didn't give up. She didn't give up. Maybe at a time when she was separated from her husband forcefully, and she stayed obligated to stay at Mecca, she may say, "Khalas, I will stay in Mecca and I will stay with my son, and I will not make any resistance. I will not tell them anything. I will make as they want, as they wanted me to do, and surrender to them." But Sayyida Salama didn't do that. Sayyida Salama was resisting, and she didn't give up, and she always had her belief in front of her eyes. She have her target very clear, and made all the difficulties like a bridge that she crossed through it to her target, to Al-Madinah. Also, we can see in her personality the reasonability and wisdom with what happened in Al-Hudaybiyah. We mentioned that it was like a chaos happened, and the Prophet was not happy at that the Muslims is not following his orders, and he came to her. She calmed him, and she was very wise in her advice to the Prophet ﷺ, when she told him, just go and shave your hair, sacrifice your animal, and they will follow you. And this is actually what happened. Her reason, intelligence, modesty, morals, and maturity made a great impression on both the Prophet ﷺ wives and on the Prophet himself. In the person of Sayyida Salama, we can see another value that Islam gives to women. She expressed her opinions as needed, when it was necessary, and to whom it was necessary, with great courage, wisdom, and self-confidence. She didn't receive any negative reaction to this behavior, which of course was something completely different or controverse the condition of the woman before prophethood, before Islam. Those who attended with me the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, we mentioned that before the prophethood, the woman has no value. She was like a property to be inherited after her husband died. Maybe his brother can marry her, or whatever, anyone can take her or can sell her even. So there was no any rights for the woman at that time. And by the beginning of Islam and the appearance of Islam, started to have all these rights, and we can see that from the stories of the mothers of believers, and also from many prominent female companions, that we can feel that they restore back their rights. So at the end of the seerah, or the life of of our mother Salama, may Allah bless us all with a share of the life of this blessed mother, who was full of wisdom and who is great example. Now we'll have a new mother that we're going to study her seerah, inshallah. Our mother to study, next mother, is a Sayyida Zainab Bint Jahsh. A Sayyida Zainab Bint Jahsh. Who is a Sayyida Zainab? Remember that we have previously mentioned the name of Zainab. Also, she was a mother of a believer. Who can remember her full name? The previous wife we took, her name was Zainab. But Zainab bint what? Who can remember? We mentioned about her that she just lived with the Prophet 3 or 4 months, and then she passed away. Who can remember her name? Zainab bint whom? Zainab bint? No, this is the one. We have Zainab bint Jahsh now. This is our mother that's going to study her. But I'm talking about a previous mother we took before Salama. Remember? Before Salama, there was a Zainab. What was her full name? Zainab bint whom? Anyone remember? We have an answer here. Look at that. No, not Salama. Zainab bint Khuzaymah. Remember Zainab bint Khuzaymah? She was our mother before, and we took her before Salama. And this is the second Zainab that the Prophet married to, and her name is Zainab bint Jahsh. Her mother was Umaymah bint Abd al-Muttalib. Umaymah bint Abd al-Muttalib. Umaymah was the sister of the Prophet's father, which means she was his aunt. So Zainab is the daughter of the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ. And her father named Jahsh was the son of the Ya'mur, and he came from another region to settle in Mecca. So now we can see that Sayyida Zainab bint Jahsh was one of the relatives of the Prophet, as she was the daughter of his aunt. Sayyida Zainab, she married before the Prophet. She has her first marriage with the freed slave of the Prophet. His name was Zayd ibn Haritha. Zayd ibn Haritha. She first married to him according or on the Prophet recommendation. But this marriage did not last long and ended in divorce. After her divorce, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ married her, and the two marriages occurred by a divine decree and divine revelation. There was a revelation for the two marriages, and this is what we're going to have now. First of all, before going to what the first marriage, how it happened, and how the second marriage happened, we have to know who is Zayd. We mentioned that her first husband name was Zayd ibn Haritha. Now we want to know who is Zayd ibn Haritha. Zayd ibn Haritha was a slave of the Prophet ﷺ, whom he had set free. He had been born the son of a free family, but was later taken prisoner and enslaved. And this happened one day while Zayd ibn Haritha was going with his mother to visit his relatives. Their caravan was raided and Zayd was taken as a prisoner and sold in the Arab market as a slave. And this was very common. This was very common at that time during traveling. If you are traveling in the desert and there is people who are coming or robberies, that they can take the whole caravan and the people to be enslaved and taken as a jawari or abid. So Zayd at that time was very young. He was just 8 years old. And he was sold to Hakim ibn Hizam. Hakim ibn Hizam was actually, his aunt was a Sayydah Khadija. Remember, we mentioned that briefly during when we talk about our mother Khadija bint Khuwaylid, that she had Zayd as a slave by her nephew, Hakim ibn Hizam. And then she gifted Zayd to the Prophet ﷺ to take him and to help him at that time. So she gifted this Zayd to the person she loved best, the Prophet ﷺ. So this is the beginning of Zayd. Zayd at a very early years, he lived in the house of the Prophet ﷺ. Remember when we mentioned about Sayyida Khadija, that she used to take care about many children in her house. We mentioned that her 6 children, in addition to Ali ibn Abi Talib, in addition to Zayd, there was 8 children that she used to take care of. So they didn't treat Zayd as a slave. She just gifted him to the Prophet, but at the same time, she used to serve all the people in her house, radiallahu anha. Also, the Prophet wanted to free Zayd when he was 10 years, but actually Zayd loved the Prophet so much, and he didn't agree to do that. And surprisingly, Zayd family reached Al-Madinah, and reached Mecca, came to Mecca and asked the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, to allow them to take their child back to their homeland. Prophet Muhammad suggested that they ask Zayd about this matter. If Zayd so desires, he can return with you, and you need not pay anything. I want you to remember that this happened before prophethood. All these events before the Prophet became prophet. He was just known as by his title As-Sadiq Al-Amin, and he used to work as a merchant at that time. So Zayd preferred to stay with the Prophet, who hadn't yet received the revelation, rather than return with his father. His father was very surprised. He told him, "You would rather be a slave than return with your father?" So Zayd replied, "I have seen such things with Muhammad that I can't leave him before the end of time." He insisted to stay with the Prophet ﷺ. There was nothing else to be done, and his father and uncle returned to their homeland empty-handed and sad. Later, an appreciation to Zayd. The Prophet wanted to appreciate him, or to make him feel more well respected. So the Prophet announced that from this time on, Zayd is not my slave. He is my son. He adopted him, actually. And adoption was very famous at that time. And adoption at that time is treating the adopting son like the biological one. He has the rights in inheritance also, and he having everything for the biological son is equivalent to the adopting one, because there was no revelation came yet for abolishing the adoption. Because all this, as we mentioned, happened before the prophethood. This is very important because what the events will happen after that is coming for abolishing the adoption. And in order to abolishing the adoption, the two marriages happen to a Sayyida Zainab bint Jahsh. That's why we come now to the story of Zayd, to know the initial story of Zayd, that he's supposed to be a slave, but the Prophet ﷺ freed him and made him his son, adopted son. Zayd shielded the Prophet with his own body from the stones that were thrown in Taif. Remember in the Sirah when we mentioned that in Taif, when the Prophet started to invite the people there to Islam, they were very rude, and they made the children to throw him with stones. So the one who protected him was Zayd. He was the companion with him at this journey. Allah Prophet took Zayd to his chest like a father and protected him throughout his life. Now Zayd grown up and become young man. So the Prophet wanted to arrange for his marriage. The Prophet wanted to arrange for his marriage, and he wanted him to marry the daughter of his aunt Sayyida Zainab bint Jahsh. Sayyida Zainab and her family responded that it wouldn't be possible. According to the traditions and the customs of that time, for Zayd, who had been a slave, to marry a Sayyida Zainab who was from a free and noble family. However, the aim of the Prophet was to actively demonstrate that in Islam all people were equal, like the teeth of the same comb. Indeed, the measure of this sublime religion is determined in the following verse in Surah Al-Hujurat, ayah number 13. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of Allah, he who is the most righteous of you. So this was the way of the Prophet thought about that. Is this all? No, there was a revelation also. There was a revelation about that. Came in Surah Al-Ahzab, ayah number 36. It's not fitting for a believer man or woman when a matter has been decided by Allah and His Messenger to have any option about their decision. If anyone disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he is indeed on a clearly wrong path. This was a very clear order from Allah. وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة في أمرهم. So this was the ayah came clearly about the marriage of Sayyida Zainab to Zayd. After the revelation of this ayah, Sayyida Zainab changed her mind and obeyed the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his prophet and agreed to marry Zayd. But actually the marriage was not successful. There was lasted about 1 year, and it was not bringing any one of them happiness. The difference between the two came to the fore quite often and caused them unhappiness. Every opportunity, Zayd informed the Prophet that he wanted to divorce his wife. And each time the Prophet ﷺ told him, fear Allah and hold on to your spouse. Do not divorce her. Okay, unable to tolerate this situation any longer, Zayd divorced the Sayyida Zainab. Here we can see what's coming up to abolish the adoption. Remember that we mentioned that now Zayd is considered and he was titled as Zayd ibn Muhammad. Zayd ibn Muhammad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to invalidate that there is no adoption in Islam, make the adopted son like a biological one. So if the adoption at that time will make the father can't, or it will be very something is more or less not palatable, that the father of adopted son to marry his wife after he divorced her. But the ayat is coming very clear. The ayat is coming very clear to allow the marriage of the Prophet from Sayydah Zainab after being divorced from his adopted son Zayd, to invalidate the tradition of adoption in Arabs who used to consider the adopted son as the biological one. And this came in Surah Al-Ahzab, ayah number 40. Muhammad is not the father of any one of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and seal of the last prophets, and ever is Allah of all things knowing. So this was the target. This is the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of this story happened, the two marriages happened by the revelation of Allah, the first to Zayd and the second to the Prophet ﷺ for a Sayyida Zainab, in order to have this issue of adoption to be invalidated, and that the adopted son cannot inherit, and in marriage his father or the one who is adopting him can marry someone he divorced. He can marry someone, and this is the hukm and the rules here, that it's not haram, it's not prohibited, that a father who is adopting a son, and this son married to a woman and divorced her, so the adopting father can marry this woman. And this happened with the Prophet ﷺ to be rule for all Muslims to follow. And remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in certain rules of Islam is made it happened with the Prophet. Remember what happened with Sayyida Aisha about the slander event. And the slander event, it was the target of this event, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make the hypocrites revealed to Muslims. This is number one. And number two is to make a very important rule before attacking or before claiming that someone is an adult, is making adultery or committing adultery. We have to have four witnesses seeing this act. So that's why the events of the slander event happen, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Surah An-Nur, he mentioned it is not an evil, it's a good. It's a good. Why? It's a good because it's coming with rules that will be followed later on with all Muslims. So here also, it was not something bad happened to a Sayyida Zainab to being married and divorced and then married again. No, it was good because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted by her first marriage to Zayd to later on abolish the adoption, which was a tradition and culture at that time. After that, we will have the marriage of Sayyida Zainab Bint Jahsh and the Prophet ﷺ, and this is what we're going to have inshallah next time. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.